Welcome back, everybody. This is another episode of Conversations on Anarres. My name is Joseph Orozco. I'm the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, projects, and initiatives that try to envision a future free of domination, exploitation, war, and empire. And one of the projects that we sponsor is this podcast, in which we have conversations with scholars, activists, artists, and organizers who are trying to work to build that kind of future. On today's episode, we are going to be speaking to someone who, in their life, spent many years on the FBI's most wanted list, hiding underground from an incident that occurred when she was a young person in connection to the killing of a policeman. She is someone who dedicated her early youth to radical political activity. And after many years of being underground, decided that she had to, for her own personal reasons of authenticity and radical practice, had to turn herself in. She has just published her memoirs about her growing awareness of what her radical politics entail. And the memoir has come out last year. It's called Surrender: My Journey from Guerilla to Grandmother. My guest today is Katherine Ann Power. Katherine, thank you so much for agreeing to be on here. I really appreciate taking your time, and I really enjoyed the memoir, and I'm looking forward to being able to talk with you about it.
I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Um, full disclosure, for everybody to know, you and I have actually known each other for over, I think, 20 years or so.
Mhm.
I met you when I first started working in Oregon State University, and you were an instructor there, and just had finished doing some of your graduate work. And this was only just a few years after you had been released from prison, I believe. Is that correct?
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. I went, right from prison to Oregon State.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, I
Well,
remember.
I was on probation, and the rules when you're on the interstate compact and you're in Oregon are that you have to go to school or you have to go to work. So, I
Ah,
went to school.
yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah, I remember, meeting you and thinking that you were a very gentle and, uh, kind person, at some social event that we were having as part of the department, and then someone told me, "Do you know who Catherine is?" And I'm like, no, and then revealed your identity to me. And I had read about you as a young person because I was a bit of a student of a lot of the radical politics of the 60s and 70s. And I had known as a personal friend Mark Rudd of the Weather Underground. So I sort of knew a lot of the cases, and yours had been one of those that I had heard about. And so I was quite astounded to run into you and to hear bits of your story. But your memoir now is the first time where you have brought together all of the parts of your story to explain exactly what led to your journey now and where you've been in the past few decades. So I wanted to start with this and talk a little bit about this journey of your life, and what brought you to being at what you might have thought of yourself at the time, a radical guerrilla fighter fighting for anti-imperialism, anti-racism in the United States, and how that sort of changed your life in various ways. So I want to begin with the story of your journey towards becoming what you call being a guerrilla. um, what was your upbringing like in your early education?
I was raised in I would say a pretty ghettoized Catholic culture. I went to Catholic schools right through, high school. Um, but it was an interesting time to be in a Catholic culture. I had Franciscan nuns for high school, so interesting little elements. They had a mission on, the Pine Ridge reservation in South Dakota, and a lot of coordination with people from the reservation who'd moved to the city. So I had we had a social action requirement in our curriculum, and the way I met mine was I went to the Indian Center in downtown Denver, and uh, I would tutor kids from the reservation. So that was my first exposure to a kind of stark poverty that was just not, my family lived a lower middle class life, um, kind of a typical American amount of insecurity. So, but there was this really different kind of poverty. And one of the things I appreciated about the way the Franciscans modeled that relationship is that they met these people with respect and just a sense of equality and dignity. And I was raised with a lot of idealism and also uh, a strong sense of mission that each life had a purpose and a mission, and mine in particular had to do with getting a lot of education, but also somehow serving with that education. But my knowledge of the world in before I left home and then went far away and went to Brandeis, my knowledge of the world was what you would find in mainstream news magazines, Newsweek and Time, and not very much exposure to opposition to the Vietnam War, for instance.
Yeah, I want to talk about this because you and I have talked a little bit about your exposure as a young adult that sort of radicalized you. I'm just curious about like as a young person, you were saying that you sort of grew up in a kind of typical lower middle class, bridging working class life. Was there anything in particular about that inclined you to radical politics? You had a strong sort of inclination towards sort of social justice service, but was there anything that sort of hinted that you might be inclined to radical politics, like overturning systems and so forth as a young person?
Well, I was always thinking about the things that I encountered. I remember seeing a feedlot for the first time. And I mean, a feedlot is an abomination. And I was just shocked to my core at it. And I said something, and I was with my mother, and I said, "What is that?" And she said, "Oh, that's just a feedlot." And then that kind of fell into, "Oh, that's where meat comes from." But I was like, there's something wrong there. And I used to read the newspaper, and one of the things, Denver, there's a lot of agricultural economy around there. And I would read that there was this great crop, and that meant the farmers would get a lower price. And I always just kept thinking about these incongruities in the world. Why? So I had a systematic and deep way of thinking about the world I was in and the way that it was put together. So let's separate two threads here, one radical, one militant. So radical is going deeply into the roots of things. So I was always thinking about why things are the way they are. Um, Militant, on the other hand, came with my exposure to the horrors of the Vietnam War and to the government's assault on Black activists, on the Black Panther Party, like literally shooting at them and bombing their headquarters and falsely arresting and imprisoning them for years. And also just in general, um, awareness about Black people's experience and the oppression of Black people in our culture, and reading things like uh, The Other America, and just starting to get systematic understandings of why the sufferings and sorrows that I saw were like injustices, and they were emergent from systems and the way things were organized. And there are a lot of things you could do in response to the way things are organized. And I started out kind of, well, going to anti war demonstrations, um, but also thinking that I would somehow um, I had a model in my life, my mother's second cousin, who lived in Boston. She was a school teacher, and she was involved with the Americans for Democratic Action. So, she was a liberal activist, and I thought, well, I could be that. I could be a professional. I was really running from the economic insecurity of my childhood and wanting more economic security and knowing that going on a scholarship and pursuing studies would be how I would get there. So I had this idea for my life that I would be some kind of professional and I would be some kind of a liberal activist. But the more I got engaged in opposing the war and looking at systemic racism and systemic poverty, the more I felt like just being involved with electoral politics or liberal politics wasn't going to be enough.
Let me
And
ask you something
yeah.
about that because, you and I have talked about this, and so I like thank you for this distinction between radical and militant, and part of the question I wanna know is, like, what drove you to the militancy? Because, as I mentioned Mark Rudd at the beginning of this. I'm sure you're familiar with the documentary that came out, say, almost about 20 years now or so, The Weather Underground. And there's a few scenes in there interviewing members of the Weather Underground, the militant student group that branched out of the Students for Democratic Society that engaged in a variety of different bombings over the course of about 10 years or so in the United States in opposition to uh, um, racism domestically in the United States and the Vietnam War in particular. And many of those people, like yourself, were underground for many years. Um, there's a scene in there where the interviewer is asking, I believe it was Mark, but some of the other folks as well, um, what drove you to militant action, to things like doing like bombing of the U.S. Capitol building? And the response was that the Vietnam War affected them emotionally and mentally very deeply. I think Mark Rudd said, quote, something like, it was driving us crazy.
Mhm.
And we didn't know what else to do. And the liberal activist route didn't seem to be doing anything. And so something needed to be stepped up. But the feeling was that the world was out of sync in a very profound way that was forcing these young people to take militant action in a way that was taking them out of everything they knew into some kind of new lifestyle, that they had to do this. There was a moral imperative to become militant and to think about using violence to get their political opinions made real in the world. What do you think it was about that experience of the racism of that was being exposed in the 1960s and the Vietnam War that was driving people to this kind of desperation?
Well, I think for me, I identified that 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 politics of rage really arose from the powerlessness that we felt. We were organizing and organizing and using every democratic avenue to stop that war. And instead of stopping, it expanded. And I think the sense of powerlessness, that was very hard to sit with, and we didn't know how to sit with that. I think these many years later, we have many wise teachers in how to sit with a sense of powerlessness in the face of a particular suffering and oppression. But then I think we really didn't know what else to do but to act in a way that made it feel like we had some power. And I think additionally, it's important to note that war was our model of change. We had a recent history of the anti-colonial wars in Africa to look at, and, certainly what was going on in Vietnam was a war of liberation on one side and a war of imperialism on the other side, and so that was our model of change, and, Dave Dellinger, many years later, when I was in prison, he came to visit me. He's one of the visitors I asked for, and he talked about the failure of the nonviolent movement, the people deeply committed to nonviolent radical action to lead us into other ways to act. He talks in one of his, I think in maybe More Power Than We Knew, he talks about May of 1971 when there were a couple 100,000 people in the streets of Washington, D.C. And he knew that like 10,000 of them were ready to sit down and block the streets. And that included members of Congress and people you wouldn't think of as radical and outside. And the moment to make that happen passed. And the leadership of the anti-war movement was opposed to that kind of disruption, that nonviolent civil disobedience disruption. And he he identifies that as key, that we didn't have guidance in that direction. What we had is a war model of change and a sense of rage arising from our inability to sit with the discomfort of powerlessness.
Yeah, that, thank you for that. That does resonate with some things that I've heard Mark Rudd say in the past 20 years or so. I think, um, Bill Ayers also mentioned this, that they misjudged in some sense at the time, the what was going on. I know Mark has sort of said to me that, um, they didn't feel that they were doing anything, but subsequently, with all these new declassified findings, that the government was really scared of the nonviolent movement and felt that it was changing things, and they were feeling pressure from that. And so the politics of rage was responding to a perceived inability to affect the government, but in fact, they were very scared of the student movement that was taking place. But it went off into a way that, according to Mark, they were easily controlled when they decided to become violent. They became outlaws, and when you become an outlaw, it's very easy then to be able to restrain your life in some ways. And so, um, for Mark and others, they misread perhaps or weren't able to see the situation. And as you say, perhaps there were no leaders to really talk about the power of nonviolent disruption. But in your own case too, you were drawn to revolutionary armed activism. Can you talk a little bit about, you talk about your journey from guerrilla to grandmother. What did it mean to be a guerrilla in your life? What did you do? What was your life like as a member of a revolutionary armed group?
Well, I I got in specifically into that kind of action, first by wanting to do sabotage. Uh, now I wanna say my judgment was way off, and I felt like the world was on fire, and I was crazy from the war. So I just really wanna preface, this thinking by saying that's the distortions in it. But I knew that the trains, moved weapons and troops, and I thought if we could weld the train wheels to the track with a thermite device, that we could literally stop the war. The Catholic left was monkey wrenching draft files. They were really disrupting the draft. So the idea that these things could be disrupted was powerful. So that was what I wanted to do, but I didn't know how to do something like that. And I kind of put the word around at the Strike Information Center in the summer of the strike uh, that I wanted to do something more. And I actually met with a returning Vietnam vet who really wanted to go to British Columbia and kind of get his soul back together, but was willing to do something like this. But when I was talking with him, I could just tell it was more important. I mean, it would have been violence toward him to say, "Yeah, come, let's do this militant sabotage thing." But then there was Stanley Bond, who was older. He was 26 and I was 21. So I was still a youth and he was an adult. I think that's the life stage difference. And he was on the Brandeis campus on furlough from a prison in Massachusetts for a series of armed robberies. And he was a Vietnam vet. And he heard that I wanted to do more. And he said, "Well, I'm putting together a guerrilla group, and do you want to join?" And I said yes. And I think that was the recruiting office, and I didn't know what I was signing up for. And I think if you look at the stories of every veteran from those times, that's our common experience. There was the recruiting office. I didn't know what I was signing up for. I said yes, whether out of belief, my enlistment in the Revolutionary War was voluntary. So the actual being a guerrilla revolutionary was a really odd mix of the very mundane, um, going to buy a car, just kind of being a quartermaster. But on the other hand, the tactic that um, Stanley Bond had identified for this group was to rob banks. The Certainly the Latin American revolutionaries were robbing banks to finance their revolution, and nobody who thought they were revolutionaries at the time, I think this is true of the Weather Underground and others, none of us really knew what a revolution was. We knew you needed guns, you robbed banks to get money, um, and it would all emerge. It would all just, that somehow that revolution would happen. Um, so I think nobody was thinking straight. Uh, One of the experiences for me was that I was violating something in myself that you kind of encountered when we met at the party at Oregon State, which is that I'm not a rule breaking and um, I'm not a violent person. I don't, even as I was acting out the politics of rage, I wouldn't have punched anybody and I wouldn't have deliberately hurt anybody. And of course, where I was really culpable is that it didn't matter whether I was going to deliberately hurt somebody or not, people were going to be hurt because I and others were running around with guns. And so it was really this odd combination of the mundane and the very frightening and the um and the rule breaking and norms violating, and also, like people who were in combat, kind of being afraid I could die at any moment. Really not expecting to live through this experience.
You write in your memoir that about that experience. You captured it very well. That it was these moments of prolonged extreme boredom, sort of punctuated by these really sort of scary moments of planning for violent actions, and just with this horizon of possible like death at the hands of, the police or the military. So it was a weird combination of, as you put it, the mundane and the really terrifying. Um, and so, what this journey did lead you to, and your group to be part of a militant action in Boston that the chain of events led to the killing of a police officer during a bank robbery. Um, and at that point, um, you went underground for over 20 years.
Mhm.
Um, can you talk a little bit about why you thought that going underground was what you needed to do? Why did you decide that you had to change your identity and try to live secretly for the next 2 decades in this kind of secretive way where you really had no one, no community, and you couldn't be in touch very much with your own family and so forth? What was the decision for you to decide to go underground?
Well, at first, it was just a continuation of being at war. Um, I would say a sort of a relational mental state of being at war, because as soon as I saw what the guns meant in terms of just somebody dying, a bullet-riddled body and a person dying at the end of that, I got rid of guns. I was like, "Done. No more guns for me." But the idea that resistance to an illegitimate government was a sound way to organize your life seemed pretty reasonable. Um, it Part of it was this idea of defying the government's uh, sense. The government, authoritarian cultures want people to believe that they are all powerful, that resistance is futile. And so successful resistance for a very long time felt like a powerful act. It felt like, compared to the alternative, what was the alternative? Um, the alternative would be to, at one point early on, uh, I met with an attorney who said that Susan Sachs and I were not in very much trouble. We could surrender, we could go back, and we could testify against against Stanley Bond and the other 2 men, and we wouldn't be in as much trouble. And that just didn't make any sense at all. That the idea that I would become allied with this government to make my life easier it was just unthinkable. So, right through the entire period of being a fugitive, however much I let go of the idea that there would be a revolution that finally resolved these systemic forces, and however much I had to f- then be an activist on the scale of daily life and how to parent and how to be in a community and maybe how to organize against the first Iraq war, um, in '91. So, even as I shifted what I thought it meant that I was doing, the idea that I wasn't gonna be living my life in opposition to that government, that never came up for question.
It's interesting. I mean, so that's on the kind of like the ideological level of your understanding of what life was for underground. But what was like the sort of mundane day to day thing of living secretly for 20 years? Like you were living with assumed identities. You could not be in contact very much with friends or family. Uh, and you had to move many times to when you thought that people were starting to get to know who you might really be. What was that experience like?
Well, some of it was just ordinary working class life. Get a job, rent a place, find some leisure fun in your off hours. So some of that was just like really ordinary living. And then some of it was r- a hypervigilance that I wasn't even aware of. It just was there. There was um I was living in Portland with my then partner Ron, and organizing co-ops in the community where we lived. And one of the other organizers, I really liked her a lot. And we were working together, organizing stuff. And she was organizing a demonstration, a march about uh, racism in the schools in Portland. And of course, she expected me to show up for it. And I couldn't. I couldn't be in a march, my picture on the front page of the paper or whatever. Had no idea what might happen, but I just knew that as a fugitive, I couldn't do something like that.
And as a
And so,
fugitive, you became a mother too, correct?
yeah, yeah, I did, which um, was an amazing transformative experience. And I think that's true in general for choosing to, for becoming a mother, a parent in general, but a mother specifically, but also for me as a fugitive. Everything I had never had anything that I couldn't leave, any relationship that I couldn't leave. I left all of my friends from my youth and from Brandeis. I left my brothers and sisters and my parents, but here was a being that I would just never leave. And so that grounding really, in the end, 14 years later, was why I had to surrender.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you, it was that experience of motherhood, the thing that drew you towards ultimately realizing that you couldn't continue your life as a fugitive?
I think it was one of the heaviest things. I first started to seriously look at what it was costing me to be a fugitive when I was so depressed that I couldn't leave the house. And I went to uh, what I thought would be a workshop on women and depression. I thought it would be led by a nurse, telling us how to manage depression with lifestyle. And in fact, it was a therapist. And of course, people with secrets they want to keep don't go to therapists. So I wanted to run screaming from the room, but I also didn't want to make a scene. Um, and the therapist, Linda Carroll, um, said something that was just my unlocked something in me. She said, "Where to each of us in the room in this workshop, where is your soul in all of this?" And that just touched something in me. If I could have described what was wrong, I would have said that my soul was living wrong. And so I started to explore what would happen if I surrendered. And at that point, I really was expecting these explorations to be reversible, to not be an irreversible giving up of the life I had built. But over the course of the 14 months of negotiation, I just came more and more to see that more than anything, I owed it to my son to get better, to heal the rift in my own life, to restore him to the aunts, uncles, grandparents, cousins that he had, to model living with authenticity 'cause I certainly would want him to do that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your turning yourself in. Um, you ultimately decided that after, a couple of decades that you needed to finally confront the forces of the government that you had been in opposition to for many years, and you were put in prison for your connection to the heist that resulted in Walter Schroeder's death, and you served for a time in prison. Um, what was prison like for you? And one thing to do, given your sort of ideological orientation, did you consider yourself a political prisoner when you were in prison?
I think everybody in prison is a political prisoner
Mhm.
because what kind of mayhem and theft gets criminalized is already a class issue. And who gets prosecuted and imprisoned for even breaking the law is a matter of race and class. And so those are political forces. So everybody in prison is a political prisoner. I m- was really deliberate in not considering myself different from the other women there. That door locked on me at night, just the same way it locked on everybody else there. And occasionally, um, people who came from the middle class and had white collar crimes would say to me, "Oh, we're not like these people." And I'd be like, "Oh, yes, we are." I mean, I know I am. I am here as a person who the state has said, "You did this, that's wrong. You're in the punishment system now. We're going to determine every element of your life." Now, I had a lot more resources than some of the women I was in prison with. I came in with better health, for one thing, and more education, and a whole year of uh, therapy and psychospiritual preparation, and a sense of a little bit of power in my own life in having chosen, to the extent that that was really a possible choice, to be there. And so I had some privileged statuses, and all there's another little interesting privileged status, which is, um, people who work for the prison, some of them will look at somebody like me and see somebody who's like them, whereas they'll look at other prisoners and not see somebody who looks like them. So, the way that acted itself out, for instance, is the recreation officer. When I didn't sign up for a garden plot on time, when I missed the deadline, she said, "I'll make sure you get in." But, there was another woman there that I know wouldn't have gotten that treatment, and she was like, at one point, I just got this great insight. We were standing at the edge of the yard, getting ready to go into our residence units, and I had a cucumber in my pocket that I had picked in the garden. Now, that was breaking the rules. We weren't supposed to do that, but there was a lot of little stuff we could get away with. So I had it in my pocket, and this woman started what I would describe as strong arming me for that cucumber. She's like, "When are you going to give me a cucumber?" And I'm like, "Don't you strong arm me. This is my cucumber. I grew this cucumber." And then I started to think, wait a minute. I grew this cucumber because that rec officer made sure I got a plot, because I'm white, and because I appear middle class. I'm like her. She sees herself in me. This woman who's strong arming me, so called, is dark skinned. She's not just black, she has very dark skin. And I was in Boston University classes with her. I know how smart she was, but she had nowhere near the educational opportunities that were offered to me. And so I just got it. I wanted to write an essay afterwards forever, and someday I will. Whose cucumber is it anyway? Because what we have in our pocket and feel like is ours because we hauled the water is really also a product of a very privileged position in the society. And so, you know, some some things came to me because of that privilege, and then sometimes my life in prison was made much harder by other projections from people who worked in the prison. I got warned that some of the guards regarded me as an enemy and they were going to make my time there very hard. And I thought, what am I going to do with that information? And I realized it takes two parties to be enemies. They could come at me with their enmity, but I didn't have to be enemies back to them. And so sometimes the enmity was very hurtful and I had to recover from the hurt, but I had a lot of resources to help me recover from the hurt.
So on the one hand, it seems like the time on the inside is that you had an opportunity perhaps to sort of deepen your understanding of systematic injustice in the United States on basis on class and race in a really kind of focused way. Um, but then you also started to think about was something that's become part of your life work since then, right? These kind of questions about conflict resolution, particularly focusing on questions about redemption and forgiveness. Um, I wonder. I've talked with various folk who have served time in prison, and they've told me different stories about their life on the inside. For instance, and these are primarily, so this might be different. I don't know for sure. Um, and I guess I'm asking. Um, One person I know has spent over a decade in state prison here in Oregon, and there were often these codes of violence that had to be enacted. So, for instance, he was put in prison for assault, uh, and at some point or another during his term, um, one of the people that he assaulted got put in the same prison that he did, and he told me that it was the code that they had to fight, and they had to go out in the yard and fight each other. And my my friend who was telling me about this said that he said he went and he found the person, and they went out and sat like on a picnic bench in the yard, and they said, "You know what I have to do to you, right?" And it was this discussion about it was this kind of reluctant conversation about the violence that had to be done, or else more violence would be done to both of them if he didn't then put the beat down on this person. And this was all just these codes that were part of the life of the on the inside. And so a very violent place. We all know these sort of studies and stories about this kind of way. Um, was this something that was part of your experience? Did it help for you to understand these kinds of questions of conflict resolution, redemption, forgiveness that you started to ponder about in prison?
Well, one big difference between your friend's experience and mine is that I was in a women's prison. And, right when I was in that prison, the research came out, which I just love, all this research about rats and how they'll behave if you crowd them. Well, a very perceptive female graduate student had the good sense to say, I wonder if those were all male rats. So they put female rats in crowded conditions. And what they discovered is that in those conditions, females tend and befriend. So we would braid each other's hair and cook for one another. And that was a really big part of the energy there. Now, there were people who were thieves and people who were batterers, and they would act that out on people if they got a chance. Um, a lot of what I got to practice is how to be when the potential for conflict, like, began when I put my feet on the floor in the morning, and it didn't end until I went to bed at night. And I could be how was I gonna be in those conflicts? Was I gonna bring a a powerful, peaceful presence? Well, what would that even look like? I could name it as a objective, but, how would I get there? Um, I remember one time, one of the women said to me, "I wanna be what you have." And I said, "That's interesting. What do you mean?" She said, "People come at you, like, with all kinds of stuff, and you just hold where you are. You just hold. Nobody gets to hurt you. Nobody gets if you're in line, nobody gets to push you out of line. In fact, if sometimes it happens, but but how do I engage?" So it really taught me about uh, a a kind of engagement that doesn't go to the what I had earlier read as the warrior juices, you know? So the warrior juices are like they're just available to arise, like, when we're driving our cars, when we're in a hurry to get somewhere. They're part of our evolutionary psychology, and so part of what I tried to do is be skillful in noticing when they would arise. And so mindfulness meditation was a really big part of how I got that skill. And, I knew I was not going to be a regular sit on the cushion meditator. I'm just not good at that. But what I said is every time I have to wait in line, I'll meditate. Well, I got a lot of meditation in because in prison, you just have to wait in line a lot. Well, and it's also like it just prepared me to be with whatever was happening without fighting. I could just have equanimity. And I also practiced loving kindness, compassion. And I had that like reduced down. If I do all six practices that the Buddha words, phrases that the Buddhists use, I get busy arguing theology or philosophy. And so I can't do it that way. I have to do it so simple that the mind doesn't do words. So it's may all beings be safe and protected. May all beings be peaceful at heart. And of course, then, it's me, you, that person in front of me, but safe and protected, peaceful at heart. So I'd like literally walk around with my heart's desire for that. And that was on my face. And so I I tried to bring awareness of social forces, look at things like a sociologist and an anthropologist, a- and also be really mindful of the heart and of equanimity and a way of being that engages with what is without reacting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, in addition to the sort of the the psycho spiritual work that you were doing, as you explained here, this kind of mindfulness that you were cultivating, um, you finished your undergraduate degree while you were in prison, and
Hmm.
then when you were released on probation in 1999. Um, you then went on to pursue a master's degree in philosophy, focusing on ethics and so forth. So, um, I wanted to ask you in particular, like, why you decided to pursue the kinds of fields that you did, primarily philosophy. Like, what was it about philosophical reflection in particular that 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 you found interesting, and why do you think that you were drawn to doing philosophical work?
Well, um, I remember when I was trying to figure out what to do after prison, and I looked at, do I wanna go to Harvard Divinity School, for instance? Until I realized I looked at the curriculum and I didn't see any, primal religion, studies on it at all, nothing that indigenous people, nothing, none of the mysticism and none of the, shamanism and none of the communal, uh, practices that have been, um, most of humans' time as a species. So I said, "No, I think they're too narrow, and plus they don't walk on the ground there." That was kinda my phrase for it. I needed to come back to Oregon 'cause, I really, my son really needed me and I needed to bring him some time. But also, I had a friend, my former business partner in the restaurant had sent me Kathleen Dean Moore's book, River Walking. And I I looked at that and I said, "I wanna go study with her." And also while I was thinking, I just remember reading like somebody brought in the New York Times, somebody had a subscription, and I was reading, and they were writing about Jacques Derrida, and I said, "Oh, well, if Jacques Derrida is a philosopher, well, I guess I'm a philosopher." And I also remember I was one of my Boston University classes in prison was about ethics. Oh, and I remember I wrote it was a really fun paper to write. It was like one of the issues was Marx's alienation of labor. And if that's really true, then can a person in good conscience own a business and hire other people? So I explored that because I had been a business person. I had owned a restaurant. So I explored that in my final paper. And as I was getting ready to leave prison, I looked on the back of the paper and the professor's notes were, "You are a natural born philosopher." Now it's funny because my biology professor had said, "You are a natural born scientist." Well, I think in a way those things are kind of similar. But really, like, if what Kathleen Dean Moore was doing was called philosophy and she had a department I could go study in, then that's where I was going. So I wrote to her. I wrote to her and I said, "In prison, I'm allowed to have 10 books." And I named a few of them, and I said, "And your book, River Walking, is one of them. Can I come study with you?"
On a different trajectory in life, you might have become an academic, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of times, yeah, that's where I was headed. But
Yeah.
then sometimes I look at the unemployment rate among PhDs and I'd be like, okay, I've been an intellectual without portfolio my whole life, and I'm just going to claim it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That's good. That's good. Um, well, let's talk a little bit about your intellectual work, your memoir that you finally published in 2023. This was something that a project that you've been working on for a long time. Different pieces I've seen you talk about for over about 10 years or so. But you were able finally to bring it together in this book, Surrender. So, why did you decide that it was time to publish the book now? And what have you been hoping that your story will accomplish by getting it published now?
Um, I've been I've been working on it, as you said, for a really long time. Um, and I knew most of what I wanted to write, and I just kept refining. First, a little background piece. In 1993, when I surrendered, the judge uh, deviated from the negotiated sentence in one count and gave me 20 years probation instead of prison on that one count, with a special condition that I not profit or benefit from writing or talking about my crimes, my thoughts about them, my time on as a fugitive, basically my whole life, and with the threat to sentence me to life in prison. And so, that was pretty uh chilling is the word for that. Um and that ended in 2013. And that's when I really started trying to get my memoir into the world. There was an an agent who had wanted to do it for a long time, and um, he took the several chapters that I'd written and the proposal for the rest of it, and felt that it was really, he called it superb, but really he couldn't didn't have any success in placing it with a publisher. Um, and I just kept writing it and refining it and finishing chapters. And I finished, you know, along about 2016, except for the final chapter. And a friend of mine said, "Oh, with the Trump election, or with the yeah," he said, "You're gonna have to rewrite the final chapter." And so everything kept changing, and I just couldn't quite get that final chapter right. And but in the meantime, I did what writers do. I workshopped it and just kept trying to bring it into the world. And so finally, um, I got it into the world. And I feel like I really I finally said what I wanted to say in the final chapter, which is, what did I learn, and what does that mean for how I live now, and how we might all look at where we're at and work with it now.
Do you do you know whether the family of Walter Schroeder has read your book or looked at your book or knows anything about it?
No, I kind of don't make it my business to know unless somebody in the family says something publicly. Um, and that hasn't happened. There have been statements from members of the family in the past that really indicate that an enmity between us is over, and that I should really have the life that I hope to have.
Yeah, that's some of the most moving parts of the work in which you talk about going for parole hearings and having to face the family of Walter Schroeder and some of the most moving, right? Where at some points where they have um, seen you, that is, seen who you are and the work that you've done to understand the consequences of your work and the kind of harm that you helped to perpetuate in the world and what you've been doing for so many decades to try to um, change your life in a way to think about those consequences. And that you acknowledge that you think that the family saw that going on. Those were powerful pieces of the memoir, I think.
Thank you. I think the story of an enmity resolving is very powerful for our times, because when we're in the midst of conflicts, they seem intractable. Like when I think about Gaza and the Palestinians and Israel, it feels like this conflict is so old and will go on forever and ever and ever. And what is so is that people do make peace. And I I just feel like that's the most powerful story in the whole book.
Well, I wanted to ask you about this, and thank you for sort of bringing it around to this kind of question. I mean, I think that, in talking with young people in my classes, in my political philosophy classes, which is what I primarily teach, there's a lot, amongst Gen Z folk between the ages of 18 to 29. There's a lot of, one, just sort of distrust in political leadership in society. That there are a lot of them that feel that all politicians are lying, working actively to destroy the foundations of our country, of our world. There's a lot of anger, also a lot of nihilism, a lot of sense that things are just we're doomed as a species. Um, And so there's a lot of anger, a lot of loneliness, sadness amongst young
Mhm.
people. And they're growing up and have grown up in an extremely politically polarized world, and in particular in the past 5 to 10 years, a world in which violence toward government or towards one another has become increasingly more viewed as more justified. I think especially after January 6th, there was one poll that said something like up to 21% of Americans agreed that violence against the government was justified if it was doing, things that they consider to be against their own political interests. But this also extended to violence against fellow citizens that they considered enemies. So after that period, January 21st, there was, many millions of people in this society who were thinking along the lines that you did back in the 1970s about the justification of violence towards one another and towards political enemies. So a really sort of a stew pot of kind of noxious attitudes. This is what young people are finding themselves in nowadays. Um, I wonder what lessons you feel the story of your life has for young people, people who might now be drawn into this kind of nihilism about the future or a kind of despair about the severity of the problems that we face. You talked a little bit about the way in which your generation faced similar circumstances having to deal with the Vietnam War and with racism. But now we're dealing with things like the possibility of the existential end of humanity through things like climate change, and the disasters seem to be so much bigger. And I think young people feel it. Um, what do you think that your story can help with young people facing these kinds of realities?
I want to acknowledge that what we're facing in these times is really, really hard. And it's hard in a different way from the late 60s and early 70s. But it's also kind of nothing new under the sun. My most important teachers in how to be with this are people who have centuries of, like sometimes I think some of us go around saying the sky is falling, the sky is falling. But for indigenous peoples and for people who were taken into slavery, the sky fell 500 years ago. And they have built ways of being human and making a life under oppression and creating liberation and trying to bend the arc of justice. And so, one thing I think is really important is to look long and deep and wide. And another, I think, is to be really grounded, grounded in the land where you are. I sometimes think that if you just grew all the food you needed, or at least as much as your climate would accept, in one place for like 2 years, you would understand the whole human project differently. So, part of what is making it hard right now, I think, for young people is that there's a lot of abstraction. So, when I think about climate change, for me, I think about suffering. I think about displacement. I don't think about the end of our species because that's an abstract. Our species is going to end sooner or later anyway. Or it's not, or it's been through bottlenecks before. But what I think when I think about suffering, then I say, whoa, what can we do? Well, one of the things I do is I pay attention to the stories of how people are managing with the climate change that's already happened in some of their places. And this is one of the most important things we can do is get the stories of where people are having successes in making new things socially and agriculturally. So in Africa, in parts of Africa where, we can just it's so frightening how much displacement and suffering there can be with climate change. There's also very successful recovery of ancestrally important crops that are adapted to harsher climates. And that, the UN talks about how much of the human food supply is generated by smallholders, not ConAgra and Nebraska, but smallholders in Africa. And if they are working together and solving these problems and being what humans are, which is full of ingenuity and the capacity to work on things together, it makes me feel less despair when I know those stories. And so I just look for the stories of, uh, uh, especially grounded stories of people um, building resilience in ways that aren't maintaining capitalism and extractive economies, but that are, and also stories of people having ended certain kinds of extraction. We haven't ended every kind of extraction. And the people who are responsible for petroleum, for fossil fuel extraction, have doubled down. They're like, no, we're just going to keep on doing it. We owe pension funds and, we're going to do it. And it's like, it can make us feel very powerless. But the fact is, extractive industries are being shut down. Their capital is being dried up, and sometimes from surprising places, like pension funds that want to say have to pay out in 20 years and say, you know what? This is an industry that's not going to be able to pay out in 20 years. We have to get our resources out of it. So contradictions are everywhere. And so I think my my thought is look for the contradictions. Look for the places where the dominator extractor model is ready to fall in one little place. Work to kick out the support on that one.
Yeah, yeah.
And you'll feel powerful. The dominators thrive on making us despair.
Yeah, so focus on stories of resilience and alternatives, um, gives hope, in a realistic way that things can be different. Rather than I often think that nihilism is built on this kind of, rather than hope, a kind of optimism that things always get better or should be better. And we see clearly that in the past, like you're saying, that sometimes things don't necessarily get better, but that what's true about us as a species is resilience and ingenuity.
Yeah.
That focusing on those stories can give us hope, rather than kind of a naive optimism that things always will get
Right.
better. Maybe that's what's hindering us most. Our moral imaginations is optimism rather than
Yeah.
sense of hope.
The reason I called my memoir Surrender is because sometimes, I mean, that's the fundamental lesson in it. Sometimes we are up against forces that in that situation have more power than we do. So, what then? What happens if we say, all right, I surrender? Well, the first thing that happens is you step back and you get a bigger vision and you see what else there is. And so there's sometimes you see a different way out of the situation. Sometimes you see a new ally against this force. And sometimes you just see who you're going to console yourself among and how you're all going to share what's available to us so that we get through and have the strength to see the next opportunity. You know, you said something that made me really think. I think the politics of rage arose because my generation was the last ones that believed we lived in a democracy. maybe Gen Z is the last ones that believe things are just naturally gonna get better. And that's the the loss of that idea is could leave a person really nihilistic, and the answer is that was never a true story. That a lot of what we saw over the last 100 years in apparent growing wealth was really stolen from other parts of the world or stolen from the future. A lot of those stories weren't true. And on the long arc, we're part of a species that thrives in many different circumstances, and we can claim that.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I mean, I think that it chimes in a little bit too. I often talk with my students about the idea of the American dream, and especially I think Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In the last few years of his life, started talking about alternatives to the American dream, and believing that the traditional sort of picture that, as you're saying, is one based on extractive economies, militarism, that is simply unsustainable. That we need to rethink what the American dream could be. And he started to articulate this vision that was one of interconnectedness, uh, sort of focusing on systematic thinking about the world in a variety of different ways. And of course, that's the period where he's assassinated. Um, so there is this undercurrent, I think, that comes from the radical work in your generation of rethinking that idea of what prosperity means and what the American dream can be. And I just saw a survey that came out very recently of American attitudes, um, by the Associated Press, that had some interesting thoughts towards what you were saying. That Gen Z tends to believe, there's a large number of Gen Z at least that believe that the United States is not a democracy. The worrisome thing, perhaps in a way, is that when asked whether or not they think that democracy is an essential part of the character of the United States, um, only about uh, 6 out of 10 Gen Z say no, that democracy is not an essential part of the United States as a nation, which is compared to almost 90% of other generations who believe that it is. So there's a lot of young people who are turned off by the idea of democracy, whatever that means in their head. And so it's a question: do they not like cooperative politics, or are they fed up with what they understand to be democracy in the United States? But in some, there's a lot of real troublesome sort of figures there that people are really not with the program, and that could be filled up with a lot of different visions. And some folks are attracted to far right utopias and toxic masculinity ideals that fill in the ideas of power. So I think that your message of resilience, of looking at alternatives, is really timely and really important, particularly for young people searching for meaning right now.
I think so. I think, to take um, that idea that what we've all been taught as democracy, um, as this ideal and best in the world way of organizing human life isn't this story of it is really, really false. And to say, to not give up on the idea of mutual ways of being, which democracy hasn't hugely meant. Let me say, because some of it has. The mutual way of being that we pay taxes and build roads and schools, that is in fact the thing that the right wing is trying to destroy. And um we don't want to give up. I mean, one of the differences, one of the things I think about us in the late 60s and 70s, we're actually trying to build something. The Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention was in 1970, and the Panthers' 10-point platform was jobs and housing and food and an end to state violence. So those are profoundly democratic ideas, and they have been minimized and pushed aside in what people seem to mean when they talk about democracy. And so if it's only the two-party system and it's never going to be allowed to have answers that are outside of certain preset bounds, then it's a good thing to be fed up with. But then if you're grounded and you're local and you're working in alliances and suddenly you have people working against the carceral state and they're trying to elect mayors and uh, uh, attorneys general and DAs that are not so narrowly carceral, all of a sudden there are pieces of democratic institutions that can be really liberatory. And so, again, I think it comes down to being on the ground with people and holding our abstract ideas kind of lightly and being empiricists instead.
I appreciate that very much. Yeah, thank you. Well, Katherine Ann Power, I really appreciate you coming out and having time to speak with me about your memoir, Surrender: My Journey from Guerrilla to Grandmother. I hope that we can continue conversations and we can continue collaborations between you and the Anarres Project. Thank you for speaking to us and helping us to understand a little bit better about questions about resilience in the face of despair and what it means to be grounded. Appreciate that, and good luck on continuing with your book tours into the next year.
Thank you so much. What a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for spending some time with us. If you are interested in finding out more about the Anarres Project, you can find us at our website, anarresproject.org, or you can find us at all the social media. We are on Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, Mastodon, Blue Sky, Threads, and Instagram. Find us there, check us out, send us some word. And you can also find, of course, us on YouTube if you're not watching us, or you can listen to our podcasts on Spotify or wherever you find your podcasts. You can find us. Let us know what you think about our conversations. We'd love to hear from you. We'd also love to hear about suggestions about what you think we ought to be talking about to explore and expand the radical imagination. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Katherine.
Thank you.